The estate was immense, nestled in the rolling hills of Napa Valley, a mansion that seemed to declare its own dominance over the landscape. It wasn't the first time I'd stepped into a room full of wealthy relatives, but this night felt different. The usual buzz of chatter, the clinking of fine wine glasses, and the polished smiles made it clear tonight wasn't about connection or family. No, tonight was about one thing, proving who was truly on top. And as always, I was the silent spectator. I took my seat near the grand fireplace, the flames casting a soft glow over the polished floors. It wasn't because I liked the warmth, but because from here, I could watch everything unfold, the show that would play out just like every other family gathering. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sharp edge that I couldn't shake off. I leaned back, trying to blend into the background, not wanting to be part of their endless competition for superiority. Preston, as always, was the first to begin. He swirled his glass of wine, slowly savoring each word as if every breath he took was calculated. "Just bought a ranch in Jackson Hole," he said with that all-too-familiar smugness in his voice, watching for anyone's reaction. "Right next to the guy who owns half of Silicon Valley." "Impressive!" Cassandra chimed in, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. She flipped open her designer clutch with an exaggerated flourish, as if it were a performance in itself. "We just closed on a vineyard in Tuscany. Private access to the Med. You can't even put a price on that view." I didn't need to fake a smile. I just hid behind my glass of iced tea, the ice clinking as I set it down. If they only knew. If they only knew that the humble life I led was a carefully crafted facade, that beneath the surface I was quietly building something far more powerful than they could ever comprehend. But of course they didn't know. And they never would not, until it was too late. Then, as if on cue, Aunt Evelyn's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. "Daniel, you've been awfully quiet," she said, her tone sharp and probing. "We were just wondering about your living situation." Preston leaned in, his faux sympathy dripping from his words. "Yeah, still renting, right? The place on Alder Street?" I set my glass down slowly, meeting their gazes with a calm I didn't quite feel. "I like the space," I said evenly, my voice betraying none of the anger that bubbled beneath. Cassandra laughed, an exaggerated sound that bordered on mockery. "The one on Alder Street, huh? Didn't know people our age still rented. I thought you'd be doing better by now, Daniel." I almost laughed, but I held it back. They had no idea Alder Street was one of the first acquisitions of Harrington Real Estate, a company I founded years ago. They thought I was just some tenant struggling to make ends meet in an old, cramped apartment. What they didn't know was that I was the one calling the shots. I owned Alder Street and most of the buildings around it. They had no clue that the life they thought I was living was a mere shadow of the empire I was quietly building. But I stayed calm. I couldn't let them know. Not yet. I'd let them continue to believe I was just a small player, one who didn't have the means or the ambition to break free from their narrow view of success. "Still renting, huh?" Preston said, leaning back with a smug grin. "I guess some people just don't know how to grow up." It was the kind of remark that used to sting, the kind of comment that used to make me second-guess myself, doubt the path I had chosen. But tonight was different. Tonight, I wasn't going to sit in silence. Tonight, I was going to show them exactly who I was. "Real, you want to talk about real?" I asked, my voice sharp but controlled. "Try a $2 billion portfolio of multifamily buildings, commercial towers, and yes, the very Harrington Tower you're all so proud of. I own it." Quietly, discreetly under the radar. The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the clink of glasses that had been set down so abruptly, they almost rattled the table. Preston's mouth hung open, his words lost in the air while Cassandra's smug expression flickered with confusion. "What are you talking about?" Preston stammered, disbelief clouding his face. "You're just the renter. The one who can't even afford a mortgage." I smiled, the kind of smile that only someone who had been underestimated for years could give. "I've managed just fine, Preston, but you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? You wouldn't know about doing the hard work in silence, building something meaningful without the need to flaunt it." I could see the shift in their expressions. They were starting to put the pieces together, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. "Let's talk about Alder Street, shall we?" I continued, my tone steady, my confidence growing with each word. "I bought that block. I'm in the process of renovating it. Not tearing it down like you all assumed. I'm restoring it, preserving it. Something you'll never understand because you only see property as a means to an end. I see it as something that can last." Their faces were a mix of surprise, confusion, and something else, fear. The realization was starting to dawn on them. The quiet, Humble Daniel they had so often dismissed was no longer the same person. I wasn't the underdog they had written off. I was the one who had been quietly building my own empire, and now they were finally seeing the truth. I leaned back in my chair, watching them process what I had just revealed. The silence was thick, heavy, and for the first time that evening I felt a sense of control. I wasn't here to prove them wrong. I wasn't here to compete with their hollow, fleeting success. I was here to show them what real achievement looked like, and in that moment I knew they were beginning to understand. If you've been quietly rooting for Daniel all along, don't miss the next chapter of this journey. What happens when the family realizes the one they mocked is now holding the keys to everything. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more. This story isn't over yet. There's much more to come and you won't want to miss it. The silence that followed the revelation of my investments was more profound than I expected. As the last words of my confession hung in the air, the weight of the moment pressed down on the family gathered around the grand dining table. The stunned looks, the quiet gasps, and the sudden shift in their demeanor spoke volumes. For the first time in years, I was no longer just the black sheep of the Harrington family. I was the one holding the power, and they had no choice but to listen. I watched them closely, each of them fumbling with their wine glasses, exchanging nervous glances. Preston's face, once so sure and smug, was now flushed with embarrassment. Cassandra's tight-lipped smile faltered, and Aunt Evelyn's usually poised aristocratic air gave way to something more vulnerable, a fear she wasn't used to showing. They didn't know how to react. How could they? For so long I had been the underdog in their eyes, the one who didn't fit into their carefully curated world of excess and privilege. But that night, everything changed. I could see it in their eyes, the disbelief, the realization, the understanding that they had misunderstood me completely. And yet, as I sat there watching them process what I had just revealed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. It wasn't about showing them that I had outpaced their shallow aspirations. This was about something much deeper. It was about the truth of who I was, who I had always been, and what I had built, not for anyone else's approval, but for the sake of my own sense of purpose. The family had always assumed that I was just a failure in their eyes, the quiet one who hadn't found success the way they had. They saw my modest lifestyle, my quiet presence, and they projected their own narrow definition of success onto me. But what they didn't realize was that I had been building something far more valuable than their fleeting wealth. I had been quietly cultivating my empire not through public displays of luxury or self-promotion, but through thoughtful ethical investments that were designed to last, to grow, to provide a legacy. But now that the truth was out, they couldn't simply continue to dismiss me. They couldn't continue to ignore the fact that I had been right under their noses building quietly without the need to flaunt or boast. That was something they would never understand. The truth was, my life had never been about the external trappings of success. It had never been about buying flashy cars, throwing extravagant parties, or keeping up with the Joneses. For me, it had always been about creating something real, something that had substance and depth, something that would endure. And yet, despite my success, despite my achievements, I could see the subtle judgment still lingering in their eyes. They wanted me to fit into their mold. They wanted me to be like them, but I couldn't be. I wasn't interested in chasing empty accolades or superficial approval. My success was born from a different place, a place of integrity, of hard work, of making long-term choices that weren't about immediate gratification, but about building something that would last long after the spotlight had faded. The conversation shifted. They began to ask questions, but these were different kinds of questions. They weren't just asking about my portfolio anymore or about the properties I owned. They were asking about my philosophy, about my approach to business. They wanted to know how I had done it, how I had built an empire without losing my sense of self, and that to me was the real victory. But there was something else lurking beneath the surface, something that I knew would be harder for them to understand. It was the very thing that set me apart from them, the thing they couldn't grasp because it didn't fit into their narrow definition of success. I didn't do this for the money. I didn't build my empire to show off, to make a name for myself. I built it because I believed in the power of what I was creating. I believed in the impact I could have on the communities I was investing in, the families I was helping, and the people whose lives would be transformed by the work I was doing. As I sat there watching them ask questions, I realized that they would never truly understand. Not in the way I did. They would never understand what it meant to make a difference, to create something that was bigger than yourself, to build a legacy that wasn't about wealth or fame, but about making a real lasting impact on the world. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for them. They had been so consumed by their own self-importance, so focused on their own need for validation, that they had lost sight of the bigger picture. They had forgotten what it meant to build something that mattered, something that would outlast them. It wasn't just about the buildings, the investments, or the wealth. It was about the communities I was building, the tenants I was serving, and the lives I was touching in a meaningful way. I could see it now. The realization was dawning on them slowly but surely. The very thing they had mocked me for my quiet, modest lifestyle was the thing that had given me the strength to build what I had. I had never needed their approval. I had never needed to flaunt my success in front of anyone. I had always known that true success wasn't about what you could show off, but about what you could build that would endure. And as the evening wore on, I could see the shift in their attitudes. The condescending comments, the dismissive glances, the subtle jabs, they all started to fade. They began to realize that the life I had chosen was not one of failure or mediocrity. It was a life of purpose. It was a life built on values that mattered, values that would outlast the fleeting nature of wealth and status. I wasn't interested in being part of their world anymore. Their world of quick fixes, flashy cars, and empty accolades. I had built my own world, one that was based on integrity, community, and long-term success. And I had done it quietly, without anyone's approval, without anyone's permission. I had built something real, something that mattered. And in that moment, as I looked around the room, I realized that I didn't need to prove anything to them. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need them to understand my path or my success. What mattered was that I had built something that was true to who I was, and that was enough. As the evening went on, the reality of what I had just revealed to my family began to settle in. The silence that filled the room after my confession wasn't just the result of shock. It was the silence of realization, of comprehension. They finally understood the difference between what they had been led to believe about me and who I truly was. But even then, the real challenge wasn't just showing them what I had built. It was about helping them see the value of what I had chosen to build a legacy not of wealth for wealth's sake, but one rooted in purpose, ethics, and integrity. The days that followed the dinner were equally telling. The phone calls started coming in a mixture of congratulatory messages, confused inquiries, and of course, a few veiled attempts to take credit for what I had accomplished. They couldn't help it. It was the nature of the Harrington family. Even when they realized someone else had succeeded, they still wanted to know how they could claim a part of it. But this time, I wasn't interested in offering them a seat at the table. This was my success. I had built it with my own 2 hands, and I wasn't about to let anyone diminish it by associating themselves with it after the fact. It was strange, really. They had always thought of me as the one who hadn't made it, the one who was living in the shadow of their extravagant achievements, the one who hadn't quite figured out how to play the game. But now that the truth had come out, they didn't know how to reconcile the person they had spent years undermining with the successful, driven individual who was quietly controlling a multi-billion-dollar portfolio. My phone buzzed incessantly, a constant reminder of their sudden interest. But amidst the flurry of calls and messages, there was one that stood out, a call from my father. Daniel, his voice came through softer than I had ever heard it. There was no condescension, no judgment, just quiet, almost hesitant curiosity. I don't understand it all, but I want to. I want to learn what you've built, how you've done it. This thing, this empire of yours, it's not what I expected. You've always been so quiet about it. His words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had been the one who had been brushed aside, the one who was seen as insignificant in their grand world of luxury and excess. But now my father, the man who had once dismissed my career choices, was asking to learn from me. There was something deeply humbling about that moment. It wasn't the validation I had been waiting for, but it was something better. It was an acknowledgement of the work I had done, of the quiet, patient effort that had gone into building something lasting. The conversation with my father lasted longer than I anticipated. He wanted to know everything. The specifics of my investments. How I had acquired certain properties. What made me choose one neighborhood over another. And I could hear the shift in his tone as he spoke. The skepticism giving way to genuine interest. He wasn't asking to claim credit for my success. He was asking to understand it, to see it for what it truly was, a reflection of the principles I had spent my life adhering to. What struck me most was how he asked about my motivations. "You've never been one to flaunt it, Daniel," he said. "You've always kept your cards close to your chest. Why? Why not tell us? Why not share your success?" And that right there was the question that held the key to everything. Why had I stayed so quiet? Why hadn't I shared my achievements? It wasn't because I didn't want to be recognized. It wasn't because I feared their judgment. No, the truth was much simpler. I didn't need to boast about what I had built. I had never sought their approval. I didn't want to become just another face in a world of hollow wealth and empty victories. My goal was never to impress. It was to make a difference. I explained to him how I had approached my work, how I had carefully selected every investment each property purchased, with the intent not to profit from it quickly, but to give back to the community. I told him about the tenants I worked with, the families whose lives had been improved by the affordable, well-maintained homes I provided. I shared my philosophy with him, that success wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it was about people. It was about building something that could withstand time, that could leave a positive mark on the world long after I was gone. But it wasn't just my father who started to understand. Slowly, the rest of the family began to see the value in what I had built. Preston, always so sure of himself, called me a few days later. His tone for once was humble. He wanted to know about my business model, about how I managed to create value from properties in ways they had never thought to. It was almost comical. The very people who had once mocked me for my modest lifestyle were now the ones reaching out for advice, eager to understand the very thing they had belittled. Cassandra too reached out, though her approach was different. She didn't ask questions about my investments or my philosophy. Instead, she wanted to know how I had managed to keep everything under the radar for so long. "You never showed it," she said. "You never flaunted it the way we did. How did you manage to keep it all so quiet?" I laughed to myself when I heard her ask that. Of course she couldn't understand. For her, success was always about external validation. It was about showing the world how much you had, how much you could afford, and how much you could consume. But for me, success had always been about something deeper. It was about legacy. It was about creating something real, something that would last. And slowly, the rest of the family began to come around. My father started sitting in on meetings, asking to be involved in some of the community projects I was working on. He wanted to see what it looked like to build a business with integrity, to see the world through my lens. Preston and Cassandra, despite their initial skepticism, began to shift their approach to business. They still weren't fully convinced, but they were starting to ask the right questions. They were beginning to see the value in building something that wasn't just for the short term, but for the long term. But even as they began to understand, I knew one thing: they would never fully grasp the depth of what I had created. They would never see the quiet pride that came from knowing I had built something real. They would never understand that success, true success, wasn't about money or status. It was about leaving a legacy that mattered. And in that knowledge, I found peace. Because while they may never fully understand, I knew I had created something that would outlast them. I had built something that was mine, something real, something that would stand the test of time, and that was enough. The morning after the family dinner, the weight of the revelation still hung in the air. I had shown them who I was, not the underachiever they had assumed I was, but the quiet architect of an empire they had never seen coming. The truth, when it came to light, felt as inevitable as it was shocking. But it wasn't just the shock that I felt after the dust had settled. It was the weight of their newly awakened awareness, the acknowledgement of something they had always dismissed. I had kept my accomplishments under wraps for years. It wasn't that I was ashamed of them. On the contrary, I was proud of what I had built. But the truth was, I never wanted their approval. I had no interest in fitting into their mold and joining the ranks of those who built their success on the shallow foundations of luxury and excess. For me, success had always been defined by something deeper: purpose, integrity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the work I did had real meaning, that it left a lasting impact. And that night when I revealed my truth, I was prepared for the fallout. I knew the family would be shaken. But what I didn't expect was how deeply their reaction would affect me. The phone calls started the next morning. First came the message from my father. It was short and to the point. "Can we talk?" That was all. A simple text, but it was enough to make my heart race. I knew he had questions, and though I had always respected him, I couldn't deny the small part of me that bristled at the thought of explaining myself to him. In some ways, he had always been the one whose approval I sought the most. The fact that I had kept my success from him and from the rest of the family had been a deliberate choice, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I had grown tired of trying to fit their narrow expectations. But I knew this was different. My father had always been the type to value family above all else, but now it seemed he was seeing me for who I truly was, not the disappointment he had assumed me to be, but someone who had worked tirelessly to build something meaningful. Still, the prospect of sitting down with him, of finally breaking down the walls I had carefully built around my life, made my stomach turn with a mix of dread and anticipation. When he arrived at my office later that day, I could tell by his face that this was no ordinary conversation. His eyes held a mixture of awe and uncertainty, and for a moment, I could see the vulnerability in him that I hadn't noticed in years. We sat down across from each other, and he didn't speak right away. He just stared at me as if trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the image he had carried in his mind for so long. Finally, he spoke, Daniel. He began, his voice quieter than usual. I've spent so many years trying to get you to understand the world the way I see it, the way our family sees it. I thought you just hadn't found your place. But now I see it. I see what you've built. I just don't understand why you kept it from us. I couldn't help but feel a pang in my chest. I had never been the one to openly flaunt my achievements, to boast about my success. But hearing him voice that question, asking why I had kept it from them, made me realize how deeply their perceptions had shaped my decisions. I had stayed quiet, not because I was ashamed, but because I had always believed that true success didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It didn't need to be validated by anyone else. But now I was forced to confront the reality that by keeping quiet, I had inadvertently created a divide. I didn't want to be part of that world, Dad. I said, my voice steady but carrying the weight of years of reflection. The world where success is measured by how loud you can make your victories sound. I didn't want to be like that. I built what I have because I believe in the work itself, in the communities I'm helping, in the people whose lives I'm touching. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. I get that now, he said quietly. But you have to understand, we didn't see it that way. We saw you as someone who couldn't keep up, someone who wasn't playing the game the right way. But now, he trailed off, the realization sinking in. Now I see the game you were playing. His words hung in the air, a weighty acknowledgement that echoed louder than anything I had heard from him before. He had always been the one to lead, to make the decisions that shaped the family's future. But in that moment, I realized he was finally seeing me as an equal. It wasn't the validation I had always sought, but it was the understanding I had craved, the understanding that I had never been interested in competing with them. I wasn't trying to outshine anyone. I was simply trying to build something real. The conversation with my father marked a turning point. Over the following days, I began to have more conversations with family members, each one more surreal than the last. Preston, for all his smugness, was the next to reach out. His call was filled with hesitation, his usual arrogance tempered by a sense of humility that I had never seen before. He asked about my investments, about the philosophy behind my work, and about how I had managed to stay under the radar for so long. I could hear the change in his voice, the genuine curiosity replacing the dismissive tone he had always carried. How did you do it? He asked. How did you make it all work without the big headlines, the fancy parties, the public attention? I smiled to myself, knowing exactly what he was asking. He wasn't asking about the numbers or the deals. He was asking about the soul of my work, the underlying values that drove me. And for the first time, I realized that Preston, who had always been the first to mock me, the first to dismiss my quiet success, was finally starting to see it. He was starting to understand that success wasn't about the flashiness of wealth, but about the foundation it was built on. Preston, I said, my voice calm but firm. It's not about the headlines. It's about what you build when no one's watching. It's about creating something that has real value, something that will last long after the spotlight's faded. That's what I've been doing. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Preston finally spoke again, his voice was different. I get it now. You've built something real. And just like that, the last piece of the puzzle seemed to click into place. My family was beginning to understand. They were beginning to see beyond the superficial trappings of success and realize that true achievement was measured not by the size of the house or the luxury of the cars, but by the impact you have on the world, the difference you make in the lives of others. This wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. This was about showing them that there was another way. A better way. A way that wasn't built on ego, but on something far more lasting purpose. As I reflected on the conversations that had unfolded over the past few days, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had never needed their approval. But somehow, I had come to realize that this wasn't just about me. It was about showing them that there was more to life than what they had believed. That true success wasn't something to be flaunted. It was something to be built quietly with integrity and with a focus on making a real lasting difference in the world. And as the realization settled in, I understood something even deeper. The moment they stopped seeing me as the failure, the moment they saw me for who I truly was, that was the moment I knew I had truly succeeded. As the days passed after the family dinner, the realization I had hoped for began to settle in. The silence that had followed my revelation wasn't just the kind that came from shock. It was the silence of internal reflection, a deep, unsettling pause that hung in the air. My family had always defined success by what could be seen, the flashy cars, the designer labels, the sprawling estates. For so long, I had been the odd one, out, the one who didn't fit into their mold. But now, as the reality of my success began to seep into their minds, I could sense the shift. They had spent years measuring my worth by their own standards, standards that had little to do with the values I held dear. And as they processed everything I had said, I could see that they were slowly coming to understand something I had always known. True success wasn't about what you had, it was about what you built. The phone calls that followed were different from the usual requests for help or advice. This time, they came with a sense of respect, even awe. My father, whose approval I had always sought, was the first to reach out. His voice, though still tinged with his usual authority, had a softness to it that I had never heard before. "Daniel," he began, his words measured but sincere. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how you've built everything. It's not the way I would have done it, but I see now what you've done. You've done it on your own terms, and I'm proud of that." I paused, letting his words sink in. For so long, I had tried to live up to his expectations, tried to show him that I could succeed in the way he envisioned success. But now it wasn't about me trying to measure up to him anymore. It was about him finally seeing me for who I really was. It was about him understanding that the path I had chosen wasn't a failure. It was my way of building something that had real lasting value. "I didn't do it for the approval, Dad," I said quietly, my voice steady but filled with an emotion I hadn't realized I was carrying. I did it because I wanted to create something real, something that would last not just for me, but for everyone who comes after. The silence on the other end of the phone felt different this time. It wasn't filled with the usual judgment, the unspoken expectations. It was filled with something else, understanding. My father was finally beginning to see what I had always known, that success wasn't about wealth or status. It was about purpose. It was about doing something that mattered. And in that moment, I realized that the shift in his perspective wasn't just important for me. It was important for him as well. He had spent so much of his life chasing the fleeting nature of wealth, of power, that he had lost sight of what really mattered. And now, after all these years, he was starting to see what it meant to build a legacy that was truly meaningful. The conversations that followed with the rest of the family were no different. The once dismissive attitude from Preston had shifted. Where he had once mocked my quiet lifestyle, he now approached me with a sense of humility I hadn't expected. "You've built something incredible, Daniel," he said, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "I never saw it before. I thought you were just sitting on the sidelines, but now I see what you've done." It wasn't just the words he said, but the sincerity behind them that struck me. Preston had always been the one to belittle me, to make me feel like I was nothing compared to his grandiose successes. But now he was admitting that he had been wrong. He was acknowledging that the life I had built, the success I had quietly achieved, was worth more than any of the empty accolades he had chased his whole life. "I've never understood why you didn't want the spotlight, why you didn't flaunt your success the way we did," he continued. "But now I get it. You've done it on your own terms, and that's something I can respect." His words weren't just a change of heart. They were a recognition of a new way of looking at the world. The world they had once defined by wealth and outward success was now being reframed in a way that included purpose, integrity, and long-term vision. It wasn't about the short-term gains they had always pursued. It was about building something that stood the test of time, something that impacted others in a meaningful way. Even Cassandra, who had always been the one to mock my modest lifestyle, found herself reaching out. Her message was more guarded than Preston's, but the underlying message was clear. She was finally seeing the value in what I had done. "You were right," she texted. "I didn't get it before, but I see now. It's not just about money. It's about the people you help, the communities you build. You've created something that's going to last." It was strange, really, to hear these words coming from her. She had been the one who had always looked down on my humble choices, the one who had believed that success was only validated by what you owned. But now she was starting to see that true success wasn't defined by what you could buy, it was defined by what you could create. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see the shift in my family more clearly. They were no longer focused solely on their wealth, on the things they could buy, or the places they could go. They were beginning to see the value in something deeper, something that transcended the shallow metrics they had once used to measure success. They were beginning to understand that success wasn't about flaunting your achievements. It was about building something with purpose, something that could make a difference in the world. And as they began to realize this, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. For so long, I had lived in the shadow of their expectations, constantly trying to prove myself, constantly trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. But now I realized that I didn't need to prove anything to them. I had already done what I set out to do. I had built something real, something that mattered. The family's shift in perspective was slow, but it was real. My father started to show more interest in my business, asking me to teach him about the real estate projects I was working on. He started to take an active role in the company, not as a figurehead, but as someone who genuinely wanted to understand how to build a business with integrity. Preston began to question the path he had always taken, wondering if there was a way to approach his investments with more long-term value, with a focus on the people and communities involved, rather than just the quick profit. Even Cassandra, who had always believed in the glamour of her luxury purchases and high-end lifestyle, began to understand the importance of creating something that would last. Something that wasn't just about buying things, but about preserving and protecting what mattered. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, but it was significant. And as I looked around at my family, I realized that I had done something more important than just proving them wrong. I had shown them a new way, a better way. The true measure of success I now understood wasn't about outshining others. It wasn't about proving that I was better, smarter, or more successful than they were. It was about creating something that mattered, something that would stand the test of time. And in doing so, I had not only built my own success, I had given my family the opportunity to see the world through a different lens, to see success for what it truly was. And that, I realized, was the real victory. The weeks that followed the family's revelation marked a quiet transformation. The changes weren't instant, nor were they grand gestures. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, like the shifting of the seasons I watched as my family began to evolve slowly but surely, not just in their understanding of what I had built, but in their perception of what true success meant. It wasn't about the flashiness of their yachts or the prominence of their names. It was about building something that lasted, something with real substance. And as I continued to walk this path, I began to realize that in many ways their shift was more significant than any recognition or praise I had ever sought. My father was the first to change, though not in the way I had expected. For so many years I had longed for his approval, tried to prove that I could succeed in a world that had always seemed foreign to me. But after the dinner and the conversations that followed, I began to see him in a new light. He didn't immediately embrace my way of thinking, but he started to ask questions. He wanted to know more about my projects, about how I had managed to balance profitability with community impact. And as I answered him, I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a recognition that success didn't have to come at the cost of integrity. He began attending more of my meetings, sitting in the background, at first quietly observing. He wasn't trying to take control. He was trying to learn. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as I watched him step into a world he had never fully understood before. I had always thought that our relationship was defined by his expectations of me, by what he believed I could be. But now it felt like the tables had turned. He was no longer trying to shape me into his image of success. He was learning from me in his own way, just as I had always hoped he would. It wasn't about a father-son relationship anymore. It was about two people from different worlds coming together to build something better. The shift in Preston was almost as profound, though more gradual. He had always been the golden child of the family, the one who could do no wrong. His life was a constant display of wealth, his success always measured by how much he could flaunt. But after my revelation, something started to change in him. It wasn't that he suddenly became humble. He was still Preston after all, but he began to ask questions. He reached out to me asking how I made decisions, why I chose certain properties over others. He wanted to understand the philosophy behind what I had done, and I could see the cracks in his once unshakable confidence. One afternoon he called me and for the first time spoke to me without the usual bravado. "I don't get it, Daniel," he said. "You've been building all this quietly without any of the flash. You've done it on your terms, and I have to admit that's something I never saw before. I thought success was about showing it off, about proving you could get the biggest house, the most expensive car. But maybe that's not it at all." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from Preston. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It wasn't just about him admitting that he had been wrong. It was about him acknowledging that there was another way, a better way to approach success. And for the first time, I saw Preston not as the rival, not as the man who had always overshadowed me, but as a person who was beginning to understand what I had always known, that true success wasn't measured by what you could show, but by what you could build. Even Cassandra, who had been the most critical of me, began to shift. I had always known that she believed in appearances, that for her success was something to be seen, something to be worn like a label. But after the family dinner, she reached out to me, her message more open than it had ever been. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she wrote. "I don't know why it never occurred to me before, but you were right. It's not about the things we have. It's about what we create." I think I get it now. It wasn't an epiphany, but it was a start. For Cassandra, success had always been about the immediate gratification of wealth. It was about owning the best, flaunting what you could afford. But now she was beginning to understand that true value didn't come from material things. It came from the work you put in, the impact you had on others, the way you chose to live your life. Slowly, she was starting to change. It wasn't the same transformation that I had experienced, but it was significant nonetheless. And as my family began to shift, I found that I was changing too. The initial desire for their approval, for their recognition, began to fade. I had built my success on my own terms, and I didn't need anyone's validation to prove that it mattered. The work I had done, the empire I had quietly created, spoke for itself. But more importantly, it was a legacy that I could be proud of, not just because of the wealth it had generated, but because of the impact it had on the people I worked with and the communities I invested in. I realized that the true measure of success wasn't the money in the bank, the properties owned, or the number of accolades earned. It was about the difference you made, the lives you touched, and the legacy you left behind. I knew that my family would never fully understand the depth of what I had built. They could never truly grasp the satisfaction that came from knowing I had created something that was going to last long after I was gone. But that didn't matter anymore. The approval I had once sought no longer seemed necessary. I had built something real, something that would endure, and that was enough. The final realization came when I looked at the changes in my family. They weren't the people they had been when I first entered this world. Not entirely. They had learned something valuable, that success wasn't about the things you could buy, the places you could go, or the status you could achieve. It was about the work you did, the legacy you built, and the people you impacted along the way. And as the evening of that first family dinner faded into memory, I realized something even more important. While I had shown them the path to success, I had also given myself the permission to live my own truth. And in doing so, I had built something more valuable than any fortune. I had built my own peace. In the end, that was the real victory. And that victory, unlike any other, would last. It would endure long after the last word had been spoken, long after the last deal had been made. It was the legacy I had created, not for the world to see, but for the world to feel.